In fact, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping held talks twice on October 17 to 18, on the sidelines of the One Belt, One Road summit and bilaterally. Both meetings were quite lengthy and informative, and the work of the Russian delegation should be added to them. In principle, the events can be divided into two equally important but externally and substantively different parts. During the summit, the leaders mostly delivered keynote speeches and emphasized mutual pleasantries and agreement. In bilateral negotiations, an abstract common interest took the form of an agreed strategy. The chief guest status given to Putin was important not only for Russia as a sign of emphasized respect for its president, but also for China as a demonstration of the strength of Russia-China interaction against the backdrop of growing tensions in the Asia-Pacific region and the United States' forging of various anti-China blocs and bilateral alliances. This kind of status is not only offered, but also accepted. One can also refuse, citing innate modesty. The fact that the parties in this case acted in unison and interacted very clearly as a pair, or if you like, in tandem, is evidence of a high level of mutual understanding, trust, and cohesion. All of this was present and emphasized during Putin's Chinese visit, despite the fact that between our countries, as between any two major players, there are common interests that bring us closer together, but also contradictions that divide us. Nevertheless, nothing brings you closer together than a common enemy. Russia and the collective West are not only a common enemy for Russia and China, but also a deadly one, as they are leading the case for a direct clash with both powers. The West's goal is as clear and transparent as a young girl's dream of a prince on a white horse. The West intends to exhaust Russia and China with a proxy war and destroy them in turn in a skirmish. In order to realize this idea, it is necessary that Russia and China, despite the proximity of their positions, would not act as a united front. Until recently, the US thought it would succeed. They emphasized China, which has a much more difficult time replacing trade and economic ties with the West than Russia. The US was not even trying to persuade Beijing and not so much to pressure it, but rather to create conditions for a deep divergence of Russian-Chinese interests. Various kinds of economic levers were used for this purpose. The most obvious and well-known to everyone was the attempt to introduce a price ceiling on Russian hydrocarbons and a grain deal with Ukraine. China is a traditional importer of large quantities of hydrocarbons and is interested in lowering their prices. Similarly, China is, and will be for a long time to come, a food importer. When China's population grows, it happens too fast and the growth in food production simply can't keep up. When the population shrinks, however, it ages too quickly and becomes concentrated in cities. As a result, potential reductions in food production are occurring faster than reductions in food consumption. In addition, Mao Zedong's dream of every Chinese person having a cup of rice a day has long been realized, and now the need, including food, is growing at a high rate. After all, Chinese civilization has always lacked food, which is why Chinese cuisine is rich in substitutes for traditional protein. The price ceiling and cheap grain from Ukraine were supposed to divide Russia and China. Beijing, according to the US plan, should have thrown itself at the bait of low prices and rigidly demanded that Russia sell hydrocarbons at the ceiling and indefinitely extend the grain deal with Ukraine. Eventually, these and other financial and economic contradictions were to divide Russia and China. Probably not very far, but enough so that you could try to deal with them one at a time. That's why the US hoped to the end that the grain deal would be renewed and asked China to press Russia on the Ukrainian issue. At the same time, the US tried to discredit the prospects of Russian routes linking China with Western markets within the framework of the One Belt, One Road initiative and to achieve a shift of the main Chinese efforts to the southern direction. Thus, it was planned not only to sharply reduce the volume of bilateral economic cooperation, depriving Russia of transit revenues and making it more difficult for Russia to implement its plans for the advanced development of Siberia and the Far East, but also to maintain military control over the main Chinese trade routes, which in the south are either maritime, controlled directly by the US Navy, or run not far from the sea and US bases, being in the range of aircraft and navy. The US has often succeeded in destroying potential alliances of its enemies by peddling real or deliberately American-created financial and economic contradictions between them, but in this case the US has overplayed its hand. With the onset of the Middle East crisis, they found nothing better than to send aircraft carriers to support Israel. I emphasize, not to make peace, but to support one side of the conflict. This way conflicts are not resolved. At best this way they can be driven under satellite until the next outbreak, but even for such a solution the US does not have enough resources right now. After all, it is not states at war with Israel that can be bombed by US airpower, but merely proxy entities that are the stronger and the more powerful their Arab Muslim and generally international support, the more Israel bombs the Gaza. If the Gaza starts being bombed by the Americans as well, Hamas credibility will only increase. It turns out that Israel alone can no longer cope with it. At the same time, Janet Yellen states that the US will pull out of funding another war. Considering that proxy wars against Russia and China on American money are already underway, against China it is cold for now, but we won't have long to wait for a hot one. We are talking about a third war against Iran. But Iran didn't attack anyone. And though it was to the advantage of the US and Israel to turn Hamas proxy war with Israel into a normal war against Iran in order to get out of the zugzwang, Russia and China cannot allow Washington, half removed from the Middle East, to re-establish its hegemony there and chime in at its pleasure. As a result, we heard from two leaders who spoke almost in unison that, first, the position on the Middle East is common, Israel's indiscriminate and excessive use of force is condemned, Russia and China demand that both sides ceasefire and return to the peace process. Second, China fully and without reservations supported Russia's position on Ukraine, expressing support for Moscow's efforts to preserve and strengthen its sovereignty and recognizing the legitimate methods used to achieve this goal. Third, Russia has announced its intention to rapidly develop logistics infrastructure, highways, railroads, port terminals, and pipelines in Siberia and the Far East to support increased trade ties with China. Fourth, Moscow and Beijing signed a 12-year contract worth bridge $2.5 trillion to supply the Celestial Empire with grain and leguminous crops. These points are more important than all the joint military exercises, as they testify to the unambiguous and definitive choice of China in favor of Russia as a reliable supplier of the two most important goods, energy carriers, without which the economy does not work, and food. Without ensuring food security, the state cannot conduct an active foreign policy, as it can be destabilized at any moment by the creation of artificial shortages, food, and the threat of famine. China rejected the Ukrainian food alternative, which not only strengthened Russia's position in the global grain market, but also actually washed its hands of the situation, demonstrating that it is not interested in what the Ukrainian future will be or whether it will be at all. All in all, this visit was the last step towards formalizing an informal but lasting alliance between Moscow and Beijing against a common enemy based on mutual long-term interest. The American concept of defeating Russia and China one by one has completely failed, but the danger of a global crisis has not been completely eliminated. In search of a way out of this situation, the US may try to finally blow up the Middle East by launching an anti-Iranian adventure in the hope that Moscow and Beijing will remain on the sidelines and Washington will thus be able to win back a significant part of the lost points. The US can no longer win. It is time for it to give up and accept a compromise peace that will be far worse for it than it was offered in December 2021. But Americans are not in the habit of giving up. That is why they are dangerous, especially because they are in a state of shock and in the nick of time, which does not dispose to calm reflection and logical constructions.